Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Wednesday, October 19th, and we will hear the presentation, Creating Policy for Local Electric Vehicle Infrastructure. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and I will do my best to answer those technical questions. For your questions related to the presentation, please go ahead and just type those again in your questions box whenever you think of them. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. I will also mention, just as a heads up, that we do have some polling questions sprinkled throughout today's presentation. So be sure and keep watch for those. If you are on a mobile device or even some tablets, you might have trouble as the polling questions are in a pop-up style. So depending on what your settings are on mobile devices, you may or may not be able to answer the polling questions. So you can feel free to just type them in the questions box, your answers, if you are having trouble. Again, if you have questions for our panelists, just type them in the questions box. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Sustainability and Resiliency series, which is a collaboration of, I think, maybe 10 or so APA divisions. So it's a great cross collaboration of efforts between many of these divisions. And it's kind of sponsored today by the Sustainable Communities division. They're the ones that kind of coordinate on behalf of all these divisions. So we love having you guys here for this series. I know we're going to hear a little bit more about it if this is your first time joining one of the webcasts from this series. Coming up next on your screen is a list of the remaining webcasts for October. Our next webcast actually is Friday, so maybe I'll see some of you back on the line. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions by heading over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits and one of, and I don't have it on there, the Sustainability and Resiliency credits, the required credit for this period of AICP CM certification. So you can head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number to log those credits. And if you can't find the title or event number, head over again to our website and we have everything posted there so you can log all of those credits. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook, just search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. That's where I post any important date or time changes. I post when new sessions are available for you to register. And then I also send weekly reminders on our newsfeed about our upcoming week's session, or in this case, sessions. And we record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So head over there and just search Planning Webcast. We'll pop up along with our well over 400 recordings. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you know when a new session is posted up onto our YouTube channel. That's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you come up with any questions for our panelists, just type them in the questions box. We'll get to those at the end of the Q&A. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Brian Foote, who is going to introduce the Sustainability and Resilience series and kind of kick off the day's events here. So Brian, it's all you.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome everyone to the Sustainability and Resilience series. I'm Brian Foote and I help Carla Ebenbach with the APA Multi-Divisional Sustainability and Resilience series, as well as the city planner for a municipality located in Southern California. In this capacity, and as the current chair of the Urban Design and Preservation Division, I'm happy to introduce today's session. I'd like to tell you a little about the series overall and encourage you to keep attending and get involved. The Sustainability and Resilience series was created to provide learning opportunities for planning professionals to broaden and deepen their knowledge on these subjects, with a range of topics available while allowing you to earn the new mandatory AICP certification maintenance credit for sustainability and resilience, or regular AICP credit if you've already fulfilled the sustainability and resiliency requirement. Already available on demand on the Ohio Chapter Planners webcast series platform or on the new YouTube playlist are 2 sessions held last September on extreme weather trends, 2 from January on climate science and planning, 1 from February on the relationship of climate resilience and health, and a session in May on 2 very useful technology tools for sustainability. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is on creating policy for local electric vehicle infrastructure. And so far, 13 states have a zero emission vehicle program or standards. That includes California, Colorado, Connecticut, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington. Also, President Biden recently stated a goal of 50% of all new vehicle sales by 2030 to be electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids, but that is not yet a rule or regulation. So, some larger questions that we may not answer today, but something to think about as we move into a new era of zero emission vehicles. And that is the effectiveness, efficiency, and equity of policies, especially public policy. Some questions about effectiveness might include, what about the feasibility and access to EV charging infrastructure? Access is easier if you have a house and can afford the infrastructure. What about local implementation steps? Are charging stations to be treated as a public utility? And will the state's Public Utilities Commission preempt local land use authority? Or is it considered an accessory structure, and would it be subject to local zoning regulations, such as a large charging station subject to a conditional use permit, like a gas station or drive-through services? And can private companies or property owners be expected to bear the full cost of installing new infrastructure and charging stations? Some questions about efficiency might include, how convenient is it for consumers? Will consumers need to plan their day around charging their vehicle? Many homes might require retrofitting. A level 2 charging outlet, which is 240 volts, needs a large appliance plug in the garage or driveway. Otherwise, a level 1 charging 120 volt often takes 6 to 8 hours for a full charge. And what about energy availability or lack of electricity supply? In Southern California, where I'm located, there can be limited supply or rolling blackouts during heat waves in the summer and fall. And that's due to excessive air conditioning use or intentional cutoff by the energy suppliers to prevent wildfires. Deliberate rolling blackouts in Southern California can last a few hours and typically occur in the late afternoons and evenings when there is peak demand. But it also happens to be when many people need to charge a vehicle. Some questions about equity could be, what about renters and multifamily residents who do not own their home, or those without a garage, or don't have easy access to overnight charging? What about the cost of new zero-emission vehicles? That can be prohibitively expensive for many households. A basic new passenger car could be $30,000 to $40,000, and a basic pickup truck could be $50,000 to $60,000 if they're all electric. And what about government-funded programs to support new regulations by increasing access to zero-emission vehicles for everyone, including moderate and low-income consumers? There could be several $1,000s for incentives from various government sources, but only enough for a down payment or purchase assistance. So those are the 3 E's, effectiveness, efficiency, and equity, that provide a framework to think about these issues. And with that, I will ask our speakers today to introduce themselves. Brian Ross.
Unmute. Greetings, everyone. I'm Brian Ross with the Great Plains Institute. I'm the Vice President of the Renewable Energy Program and an urban planner for many years, working at the intersection of planning and energy policy for communities before it was fashionable, but now it is fashionable. So I'm glad to be joined by lots of company.
Hi, I'm Jessica Hank. I am a transportation planner by trade and a senior program manager for the Great Plains Institute in our communities, on our communities team, working very closely with Brian on EVs. I have a little over 10 years experience as a planner, working for a municipality, before that working for a small metropolitan planning organization, and then also working for a lab at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm going to assume everyone can see my screen just fine.
It looks good.
Okay, first I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Great Plains Institute. We are a nonprofit organization with a little over 25 years of experience. Our focus is on transforming the energy network. Excuse me, having some technical difficulties. And we want to do this in order to benefit people, the economy, and the environment. We very much take a collaborative approach, not only within GPI, but also with our partners outside of GPI, collaborating with both conservative and progressive viewpoints, working in a more rural environment, working in an urban environment, really just to help transform that energy network. One of the programs that we are focusing on at GPI is the EV Smart Communities program. If you are familiar with Soul Smart, this is very similar to that programming. And so we are piloting this programming in several states currently, with a focus of helping local governments to become ready for the acceleration and the adoption of EVs. This program has 6 categories. The first is planning. Next is regulation, which we'll be focusing on today. Brian and I will focus on today. Utility engagement, ensuring that you are working with the utility in order to ensure that you have capacity for the added use of EVs. Working on education incentives to help accelerate adoption. Leading by example by electrifying the city's own public fleet or providing public charging stations. And then finally moving beyond just that, just electric vehicles that we think of as cars or trucks, and thinking about shared mobility, working with public transit operators, working on adopting shared micromobility, really getting at that equity component of EV adoption. To start, we're going to go over terminology just to make sure we're all on the same playing field. Then I'll hand it off to Brian, who's going to discuss why EVs are coming. He'll hand it back to me and we'll tag team on charging stations as land uses. Brian will then discuss, I will discuss some zoning trends. We'll then move on to zoning standards for different land uses. Finally, wrapping up with equity considerations and thinking about non-zoning tools and state preemption. Electric vehicles are considered any vehicle that can be hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, or battery technology. They span the gamut from a large bus or delivery vehicles all the way to electric bikes and scooters. You'll be hearing us say EVSE quite frequently, and by that we mean all of the charging infrastructure that is required for an electric vehicle. And so it's not just the station that you might think of, but it's also that connection to the grid. When we are talking about electric vehicles today, we will not be talking about hybrid electric vehicles, as we're focusing on the zoning and regulation related to electric vehicle charging station infrastructure. Because hybrid electric vehicles don't have that kind of infrastructure, we'll not be focusing on it. With a battery electric vehicle, it's 100% EV and must be refueled from a charging station. with the benefit of no tailpipe emissions, while the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle is that bridge between the hybrid and full battery electric. It kind of works as both, refueling at gas stations or charging stations, but has a much more limited range and is also much heavier than a typical battery electric vehicle. We're going to go to a poll now. And so we'd like to hear from you. What kind of EV charging is most important for your community as EVs become more common? It would be great to just hear more information from you all about if your focus is on level 1 or level 2 charging, or if there is focus on DC fast charging. If you haven't really thought about it yet, you want somebody else to figure it out, or if you think that the market will be taking care of it.
Thanks, Jessica. I did launch the poll, and just so our panelists know, you don't get to vote, unfortunately, so you don't see the poll.
Okay,
but it is running, and we have about 50% of folks on the line have typed their responses in. So I'll just wait a few more moments, and then I'll close the poll and share the results here.
Great. It will be interesting to see if anyone within this audience is thinking the market will take care of it. That is certainly the approach that has currently been occurring in most communities.
Right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it.
Great.
And share the results. So what we're seeing is largely 42% of the respondents say that level 1 and level 2 public charging is most important for the community. And then 22%, I'd like someone to figure this out for me. And then 18% fast charging stations, 12% level 1 and 2 charges at home, and then just 7% say it doesn't matter, the market will take care of it. So it's interesting that you say that, you know, about how it seems right now the trend is communities are just sort of letting the market take control of how things are going. Yet in terms of importance, it seems like, you know, that's not the way that those on the line are thinking it should go. So I'm going to go ahead and hide those results, and you now have the controls back, Jessica.
Thank you. Well, and so I'm not surprised with a group of planning professionals that you would not be reliant on only the market, but having those public-private partnerships, which is very important when thinking about a move to a new technology. I also,
I'm sorry, Jessica, really quickly, and you might be going over this in the next slides, but we had some questions come in during the polling. If you could explain what level 1 and level 2 charging is, and then what DC fast charging is as well, just to refresh everyone, unless, you know, well, it looks like you're kind of doing that right now, actually. So never mind, now that I'm looking at your slide. So never mind.
I was cheating a little bit. I wanted to get the an unfiltered view on what communities we're thinking about.
Jessica was sneaky on this one. Yes, she was. Okay.
I was a little sneaky.
Okay, continue on. And those asking the question, listen up.
Yeah, so level 1 looks very familiar. It's a regular 120 volt outlet that you have all throughout your home. A level 2 might look a little bit more familiar. It is typically what is used for a dryer outlet. So the same kind of outlet you would use for a dryer, you can also use for a battery electric vehicle. Sometimes installation is required for this. Sometimes it's not. There's a shift with the electric code to begin requiring level 2 outlets in garages. And so when we're thinking about range and having something like this in your home, that 120 volt is going to be much slower for charging. It just does not have the same capacity that a level 2 does. And so, however, there are many people who are choosing just to charge with level 1, and that is meeting their needs. Then finally, there is direct current fast charging. That's what we call DC fast charging. Sometimes you'll see it as DCFC. This is that super fast charging where you can get up to 400 miles in about 30 minutes and is much more closer to a typical fueling. However, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. What we are finding is that charging a vehicle is much more similar to charging a cell phone in the way that people can think about how they fuel. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Oh, you're on mute, Brian. I know, it's so hard.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Jessica. All right. And Christine. One of the things we wanted to talk about here was why we're talking about EVs. Why should communities be concerned about that, and why are we seeing a market transformation underway now? And really, there's three kind of things we wanted to touch on. One is the kind of policy issues, which include both climate action initiatives that are being undertaken, as well as some air quality issues that have always been part of kind of city planning or regional planning, but also then the economic factors which are driving this market transformation. Okay, go to the next slide. So the climate and environmental policies that we have seen undertaken from the federal level all the way down to the local level are having an effect on this EV market transformation effort. The climate issue is that transportation sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, CO2 or CO2 equivalent in the country. No other sector emits as much as the transportation sector. The power sector used to be the largest, but the rapid, introduction of less polluting sources from natural gas replacing coal, as well as the rapid acceleration of wind and solar into the electric grid, has pushed the carbon emissions down in the power sector, and it is continuing to decline fairly rapidly. So now the transportation sector, which has not seen nearly the progress in terms of reductions of CO2, is now the largest emitting sector. So if we want to actually address climate goals, we have to address the transportation sector. And consequently, there are a number of initiatives that are underway to meet that goal. Second, there is another kind of transportation initiative that happens at the federal and state level, mainly driven by the federal regulations. We've talked about carbon emissions, but there are a number of other regulated pollutants for which the light duty fleet of vehicles in this country is primarily responsible. This is actually a big equity issue, and one of the things that when we talk about equity, we need to kind of distinguish in EVs. We need to distinguish kind of two elements of equity. One is, as Brian Foote kind of noted, how do we make sure that low income and communities of color, BIPOC communities, have access to the benefits of the EV market transformation. But the second one is that those communities are the ones who have historically been subject to substantial amounts of health risk and health impacts from air emissions from our transportation corridors. And that is something that we have struggled with as communities, and the planning community has talked about for some time. One of the solutions to that is to transform and electrify our transportation fleet. So we have an equity issue that is about who is bearing the impact of the emissions from the gasoline-powered vehicles and diesel-powered vehicles, and that is very clearly the most vulnerable people in our society. And changing that is something that we have a lot of policy initiatives underway for a long time, and EVs show a very effective vector for addressing that. But those are primarily at the federal and regional level when we talk about those kinds of emissions. But we also have many local governments that are also taking policy initiatives, both from the standpoint of climate as well as energy or sustainability goals, for which EVs and the adoption of EVs is an important element for implementation. So this is something that we are seeing at the local level, the need to understand and move forward with EV market transformation efforts in order to meet local goals, in addition to the kind of state and federal goals that we're seeing. Many of the things, though, that are important is to keep in mind, is that that states that are taking actions and on these climate issues, and even if you're a community that has not adopted EV adoption goals or climate goals or sustainability goals, you are going to be affected by the state actions, which include a number of different market transformation efforts, low carbon fuel standards, which a number of states have adopted or are in the process of adopting, market transformation plans that have been adopted by states, as Brian Foote kind of described already, incentives that are coming out not only at the federal level, we have a large number of new initiatives recently that have come out at the state level, but also for utilities. We're seeing a lot of utility incentive programs that are being put in place, because utilities not only have mandates from the state to do this, but they also have a self-interest in a new market share as transforming the the transportation sector to electricity, and then a variety of tax policies as well. Okay, next slide. So those are the policy kind of based drivers. But again, one of the things we have to keep in mind that the EV market transformation is not just about meeting environmental goals or health goals or sustainability goals. It is being driven by the fact that EVs are likely to be the cheapest form of automobile and transportation in the very near future. In fact, there's certain kinds of vehicles now. Some of the vehicles are already demonstrably cheaper on a life cycle cost basis than their gasoline equivalent. Oops. Can we go back to the other slide, Jessica? Thank you. Second, there is the major car manufacturers have, in recognition of this, have announced transition plans to be primarily or exclusively EV in the future, and we have seen, as a consequence, some greater interest in how we develop infrastructure to support this market-driven initiative. The biggest local planning consideration for the EV market transformation is how do we accommodate for or accelerate the installation and building out of the charging infrastructure, regardless of whether or not a local government has adopted the policies to support the local policies to support charge transformation. Okay, now go to the next slide. So part of this charging infrastructure question is, and this goes to the market element that we just kind of discussed in the last polling question, what comes first, the charging infrastructure or the vehicles? One of the big market barriers to consumers adopting EVs is range anxiety, which is the whole refueling question is very different for an EV than it is for an internal combustion engine. Everybody understands you want to charge an internal combustion engine, you want to refuel it, you have to go to a gas station. That's the only way that you can recharge, right? The only way that you can refuel that vehicle. The lack of visibility of such public facilities like gas stations creates range anxiety, even though with EVs, 80% of charging is probably going to happen at the home. And so we have a need for creating that charging infrastructure, but we have a market that is going to wait until there's demand to serve it before it will install it. So do we wait until the infrastructure is in place in order to resolve range anxiety, or do we try to resolve range anxiety by installing infrastructure even when there may not be full sufficient market demand for it? The National Renewable Energy Lab did a national infrastructure study back in 2017, which is still very valid, identifying that one of the primary barriers to EV adoption was the need for non-home public charging. That was the single biggest barrier to EV adoption. And we are seeing some attempts to accelerate that via federal legislation, both the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the IIJA, as some people have referred to it, or the Inflation Reduction Act, which just came out. Both included substantial incentives for charging infrastructure as well as for vehicles, again, accelerating the market. I had a couple of slides on these, and I decided not to go into them because we could do a whole nother webinar on the kind of incentives that are in there. But there are huge numbers of incentives for consumers as well as for local governments for both infrastructure and vehicles. Okay, next slide. And I believe that's you, Jessica.
Yeah, and now I'll be talking about charging as a land use, and I have another one of my sneaky polls in here. And so I'd like to find out more from you all if you think of EV charging station as the same type of use as a traditional gas station. We've kind of already started having a little bit of that discussion. It's a simple yes, no, or you're not sure. And this is really how you think of EV charging station.
Okay, the poll is launched, and got about 60% voted so far. You guys are great. While we're waiting, I do have one question. Is what is a level 3? Is that a thing?
So some people call DCFC.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Fast charging level 3.
Okay.
I'm a little hesitant to just go ahead and call it level 3. However, I think it's more appropriate to call it DCFC because there are new technologies advancing in this field all the time. And so if you start labeling DCFC as level 3, and there's a new technology that gets classified as level 3, you had something like that in a zoning ordinance,
sure,
it could be problematic. So it's best to use this more general language.
Got it. And related to this question, are we referring to public EV charging stations in this case, I assume?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Great question.
There's a lot of questions coming in too, so we'll see what we can get to. All right.
Well, we're gonna get into this. So yeah.
Let me close and then share our results. Is an EV charging station the same type of use as a traditional gas station? 62% say no, 23% say yes, 15% say I don't know. So tell us, what's the word?
Great. Well, and so it certainly depends on who you talk to. And I'm going to discuss now how traditional gas stations are classified as a land use and how that intersects with the EV charging station as a land use. Current business model of traditional gas stations requires actually a coupling of land uses. Most people do not realize that about 70% of gas station revenue comes from coupled land uses rather than from the actual sale of the gas. And so when you're thinking about gas stations and their importance, I would say that from a revenue generating perspective from a business owner, their model is going to be on a coupled land use rather than it is on fueling and funding from fueling, revenue from fueling. And so we'll see traditional gas stations sometimes as a principal use with accessory uses like a convenience store or car wash. Most often, however, we're seeing traditional gas stations as that accessory use sided with grocery, convenience, or large wholesale stores. There are many restrictions related to traditional gas stations, particularly with restrictions from residential areas due to the large vehicular traffic that surrounds gas stations and flow of traffic related to that, and then also the environmental and health impacts. Most of our brownfield sites in the US are related to gas station use and due to leaks from storage tanks. So with these traditional gas stations, there's a lot of impacts that are considered that are not necessarily considered when you're thinking about EV charging stations as land use. As Brian mentioned earlier, we're seeing that currently, and we're expecting this to continue, that most charging, 80% of charging, is occurring in residential homes. So you're not going to have a gas station at your home, but you can certainly have charging, and you do charge lots of equipment at your home. And then we anticipate as well, and we're already seeing this, that EV charging is getting coupled with many more land uses just because it does not have those health, environment, and safety impacts that a traditional gas station has. And so it's from the gamut of residential all the way to industrial. It's really important, however, when thinking about an EV charging station as a primary use and not an accessory use, that you'll have those kinds of destination chargers. There will be more queues, potentially, if you do not have sufficient public charging station infrastructure. And where that is likely to be seen is near major interstates and highways. So if you're a community that's near a major interstate or highway, there's funding that's coming out for that, and it's just something to think about how that is considered. And then finally, I just would like to note that when you're thinking about this from a municipal perspective within your community, really thinking about how you're going to couple that if you are going to look at installing EV charging stations, and really focusing on some recreational zones and other community business districts to help promote that economic development and vitality. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brian to talk about considerations for decision making.
All right, thanks, Jessica. As we kind of looked into this and developed some of the materials for the EV Smart program that Jessica referred to earlier, some of the elements that we identified that local communities need to consider when they're looking at EV charging infrastructure, public infrastructure being installed at various kinds of locations, there were four things that seemed to come to the forefront about questions that communities had. What is the type of use? So, this goes to kind of basic zoning. Use standards are an element that is in every single zoning ordinance. and is a consideration for an EV market transformation plan that any community might have. What is the intensity or density of the use? What is the public access of the use, which is a little bit different, I think, than a lot of land uses. And finally, what is the business case of the use, which is something that we don't think about a lot on our zoning, but is not certainly unprecedented. Okay, next slide, please. So to go over those four elements in just a little bit more detail, the type of use relates to somewhat to that type of charger, level 1 and level 2 or DC fast charging, but not that is just one element of it. When a vehicle is parked for a long period of time, it's going to be in places like at the home or at a hotel or at an airport. Similarly, other places you see that maybe aren't where the vehicle is not parked quite as long, but still for a long period of time, workplaces, park and rides, etc. And then third, there is a use case where the user is maybe not parked for quite such a long time, but will use the EV charger to top off the tank, if you will, a little bit while visiting an associated business. So you'll see EV chargers in use cases like coffee shops or grocery stores or department stores. Some of the larger department stores have been installing EV chargers as an amenity in order to help people charge while they're shopping and to encourage maybe a little longer stay. And this kind of relates, this use case relates to some of the things that Jessica was noting earlier, even about how EVs and EV charging, similar to gas stations, can be associated with other revenue streams in order to justify them. DC fast charging as a use case is going to be a little bit more akin to traditional fueling station, whether you're going to have substantial refueling of your vehicle while you wait with the vehicle, or to refueling that is enabling long range travel. So kind of the use case really talks about whether or not the charger is a destination, or is it an amenity that is associated with parking that has another principal use. Okay, next slide. So the intensity or density of the use is the next kind of criteria. A single charger has a different kind of impact than a whole bank of chargers. And that's something that is we don't have a lot of experience about where we draw the lines. And even in the context of other intensities, the picture on the screen there of a Tesla bank of fast chargers is actually in a Target parking lot, which of course, as most of those parking lots are, is a sea of asphalt. And this is kind of over on one side of it. So in this case, if you looked at this in the context of where it is, it's actually not that much. It doesn't increase the intensity of use for that particular parking area. However, if you took that same bank and you put it on a much smaller lot, if you squeezed 10 Tesla chargers or DC fast chargers onto the side of a existing fueling station at a gas station, it would have a very different kind of intensity in terms of its impact on the surrounding land uses. So some of the things to consider on that intensity or density include whether or not this is changing the trip generation patterns for that particular land use, whether or not it's going to require substantial electric infrastructure like the DC fast charging might require in the installation, and whether or not there are aesthetic standards that are associated with these different land uses, and whether or not those can be accommodated under the existing parking aesthetic standards, or if there are things that might be unique to EV charging. Okay, next slide. The third element is whether or not the public has access to the use. And this is kind of an interesting consideration because the same infrastructure it may be a different land use within the context of the community zoning ordinance, whether or not the public has access to it or whether the public doesn't. And we have a couple of examples here, broadly accessible to the public where the charger, anybody can come and charge at it, a charging scenario where it's associated with another land use, but it's restricted to customers or employees at that particular land use, or where it is completely private. Even with DC fast charging, we see installations that are serving, for instance, fleets for which nobody has an access to it except the fleet. And does that, how does that impact what kind of a use case and what kind of a consideration you're going to give it in your zoning? So I wasn't nearly as tricky as Jessica in my polling question. So we want to know how you might view the public access question as it affects whether or not charging infrastructure is an accessory use. And we have a selection here that you can make on this polling question. And I think you're only allowed to select one, so you have to kind of pick the one that you think is the best description of how the charging infrastructure is judged as an accessory use or not.
I'm going to give a couple extra moments for this one because there's a lot of words to read.
I'm not as succinct as Jessica was in my polling questions.
That's fine. So again, just which of these indicates that the charging infrastructure is an accessory use? Public charging site available to anyone, public charging available only to employees and visitors, private charging not available to the public, doesn't matter, charging infrastructure is always considered accessory, or public charging should always be considered a principal use. So again, which of these indicates charging infrastructure is an accessory use?
And I probably should have added a button for, we haven't figured this out yet.
I'll give it a few more moments here. Interesting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close. And then I'm going to share the results. So here's what we're seeing. 33% say it doesn't matter, charging infrastructure is always an accessory use. So that was 33%. 30% say public charging available only to employees and visitors to a business. So those are pretty close. And then 17% say public charging site available to anyone is considered an accessory use. 14% private charging is an accessory use, and 6% public charging should always be considered a principal use.
Okay, that's a very interesting results. I'll have to, we're going to modify our EV Smart program to reflect these results. So but one of the other things is the business case of the use that is an important consideration. That the same kind of infrastructure, and even in the same kind of use case, charging use case, may be changed whether or not there's a third-party company that is involved with providing the charging. So charging stations may require payment, and this happens in two different ways. One is that a charging station actually requires the user, the person who owns the vehicle, to pay for it. Like, and probably everybody has seen examples of this. Some of the companies, EVgo, ChargePoint, etc., that have a payment option and that own and manage the chargers and require payment. But sometimes the payment is not made by the user, or not exclusively by the user, but also by the site owner. And in fact, a lot of the charging companies, their business case is that they will actually charge the site owner for the installation and a monthly charge, and sometimes the payment by the user is offsetting that payment to the site owner. So there's different kinds of business cases and payments flowing in different directions. And we have seen anecdotally that there are communities that whether or not there's a third party entity there charging makes a difference in how they view it from a land use standpoint. So they are more likely to consider it a principal use or a business if there's a third party extracting a payment, even though there is a kind of spectrum of ways that these things are paid. So it is something that you need to consider how you're going to do this. We do see some examples of this in zoning already, right, where we have activities that happen at the home that we view differently when it's a business, a home-based business. And because there are usually some kinds of, there's some consideration of how that's going to affect surrounding properties, et cetera. So we have some precedent for this as we look at EVs. Okay, next slide.
I am going to discuss zoning trends now, and we have another poll for you. This one's not sneaky. This is just finding out from you all if your community has an EV zoning ordinance to get a sense of where we're at before we begin this discussion. So maybe you already have a zoning ordinance and you have no current plans to update it. It's good to go. Maybe you were one of the early adopters who created an EV zoning ordinance and that you're in the process of updating it. Another option might be that you haven't yet started an EV ordinance, or maybe you're in the discussion of it, or you're actually doing some planning work within the community around developing an EV zoning ordinance. So it's really just where you are at as of today.
Give it another moment.
And I will say that as part of the EV Smart programming, where we're working with local governments, we're seeing a spectrum there of communities that already have adopted EV zoning ordinances, all the way to communities that don't even have any plans yet as part of that program, but it is something that they're working towards and working towards other priorities so that they're ready to begin adopting EV zoning ordinances.
I'm going to go ahead and close and share the results. So does your community have an EV zoning ordinance? The majority, 39%, say not yet, but we're talking about it. Right below that, 33% say no current plans to create an EV zoning ordinance. 17% not yet, but we're working on it. 7% yes, no plans to update it right now. 4% yes, we're in the process of updating it. So again, the majority here is not yet, but we're talking about it. Or slightly lower than that, no current plan. So it really is kind of a split.
Yeah, and like I said, that's really what we're seeing with the communities that we're working with as part of our EV Smart programming. And I think that sounds like a great split because you're in the right place. GPI has developed a guide and a summary of best practices related to electric vehicle ordinances. Our last guide is from June 2019. However, we are currently updating it and we expect to have a new guide later this year. It's being updated because there are some significant changes in the regulatory landscape, as well as some new trends related to terminology and increased percentages. That developing terminology relates to EV capable, EVSE ready, and then EVSE installed. When we're talking about EV capable, that means that the electric grid infrastructure for charging is available in the parking area. Think more of a parking garage, a parking lot type of use. And so that wiring and the capacity is already added to the building, even if the charging infrastructure is not yet available. This is really critical for thinking about resiliency. We know that EVs are coming and that internal or combustion engines are on their way out. And so having buildings that have a very long life cycle, putting that infrastructure in now is really critical to being able to meet future demand. Then when we're talking about EVSE ready outlets, that is just purely an outlet. It's often that 240 volt outlet, so you can get that level 2 type charging. In some cases, it can be a level 1, but it's something that the vehicle actually is able to plug into. And then finally, when we're talking about installed, it's an actual charging station. And that can be a level 2 station or a DC fast charging station. As part of our ordinance review, in our last guide, we were seeing on average smaller percentages of requiring EV ready or EV installed, and we weren't seeing any kind of requirements related to EV capable at that time, or if we did, it was getting classified as EV ready. There wasn't quite the nuance between EV capable and EV ready at that time. As we're updating the guide, we're really seeing these higher percentages that are differentiating between, as I said, EV ready and EV capable. And so here we see just kind of an overview of some of the communities that we've looked at. Some of these are larger in size. It really spans the gamut. We are seeing adoption at our larger communities more quickly than with our smaller communities. However, communities that are participating in the EV Smart programming are looking at this larger adoption, higher percentage rate. And so before we were seeing maybe more like a 5% requirement. Now for EV ready, now we're seeing something that's more equivalent to 20% required. It's a really interesting change in this landscape. And then some communities go even further and are really looking at having to add additional infrastructure. I'm going to turn it over to Brian now.
Okay, and we're kind of running behind on our presentation. I want to make sure we save time for some questions at the end, so I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. And also, I don't want to miss the equity slides that Jessica has at the end. Go to the next slide. So we did come up with some recommendations for communities in terms of what they need to do to accelerate with what they can do in their zoning ordinances to accelerate EV market transformation. And we have kind of four ideas that are critically important to that. And I'll go over each one of those four in a little more detail. Go to the next slide, Jessica. So the first one is that identifying what EV charger use cases, how you're defining those within your community. So what are accessory use installations, what are principal use, and then how you want to treat and DCFC as a land use. and emphasizing that you probably want to define that separately from other kinds of charging, because it has some potential once you get to a penetration in your market that will create a different kind of land use scenario. Okay, next slide. It's important to explicitly permit accessory uses in your ordinance. Don't depend on an interpretation that says, well, this is associated with that building, so we'll just kind of get it under a general definition of accessory use. Good to clarify that, especially for developers who might be coming in and incorporating it into their new commercial development or even third-party EV chargers, installation companies that are working with an existing building to install things. Explicitly permitting AV as an accessory use in the kind of 3 bullet points below that. Home chargers should be accessory. Level 1 and level 2 installation associated with commercial or institutional land uses, and anything in surface parking areas where the vehicle parking is already allowed as an accessory use. Okay, next slide. Parking design or performance standards or something, a way that you can do this. The primary example Jessica's already discussed, which is incorporating minimum standards into your parking standards for EV installation. This may be something you want to consider varying the actual number by the type of land use. So you would get a different kind of land use, a different kind of standard for an apartment building than you would for a coffee shop, and also to consider whether or not small parking lots should be exempt from the requirement, since due to the fixed charges of installation that may be more burdensome on those installations. And also, of course, whether or not third-party providers will affect your definition of whether or not it's a principal use or an accessory use as you move ahead. But kind of that minimum standard is very important. You should also consider on the aesthetic or landscaping standards to look first to your existing standards. If you're not using aesthetic standards for other kinds of land uses or in your existing parking standards, then you probably shouldn't be applying it to EV. If you already have standards in your parking areas that are aesthetic, then it is appropriate to apply those to EV charging. But there is some uncertainty that a lot of developers have run into on this. And also the signage, of course, and how you deal with that is an important thing. Okay, next slide. So one of the important things, and Jessica went over this, is to think about this as a mixed use standard, where the business model for EV charging is going to be similar to the kind of gas station refueling, where the EV charging is there as an amenity to drive other revenue streams forward, and take advantage of that in terms of where you want to make sure that there are EV charging being built up in your community, and look for your parking standards and the like, where there are mixed uses that perhaps in your mixed use standards there should be an EV charging element. DC fast charging is something that is similar. You should look at the mixed use opportunities, but particularly as it complements other kinds of transportation corridor uses. DC fast charging is very expensive to install, so requiring it may be a bit of a challenge, except for very large developments. But you may want to consider how you move that forward, particularly on those transportation corridors. Okay, next slide. There was a question posed by Brian about where does the power come from, and I have a whole presentation that we do on solar integrated EV charging, where you, and here I have a lot of technical information showing the load curve for EV charging at a workplace. So this is just a workplace charging, and how if you have unmanaged charging, the charging load is not very coincident with the solar resource, and this is done for the city of Minneapolis, or this Minneapolis area. And if you do a managed charging, that you can actually bring the charging load at that particular use case pretty much entirely under the curve of the solar production. What this means is that if you tie the EV charging to the solar production on site, then you can basically make this EV charging at this use case transparent to the grid, and there will be no grid impacts because it will be entirely met with the solar charging. And this obviously changes as the solar resource changes up and down. But what this means in terms of zoning, go to the next slide, please, is that you need to think about things like how you permit solar parking facilities and we recommend that such things be encouraged as a permitted use wherever there are surface parking lots, so that a person who wants to put up an EV charger coupled with a solar production can do so with minimal permitting requirements in order to bring those costs down and encourage that kind of development. Okay, next slide.
And now I am going to go into equity considerations. And so when you're thinking about siting, and if it's left solely to private developers without any sort of conversation, it often can mean that underserved communities are limited in their access to charging infrastructure. There are some approaches that a community can take to help address that, including accessibility of equipment, including multifamily supportive policies in your zoning ordinance, thinking about right-of-way supportive policies, and then also finally geographic coverage. When we're looking at ADA regulations, the U.S. Access Board just this summer finally released some recommendations on EV charging. They're still working on their recommendations for a number of ADA stalls, and they're taking feedback on that right now. So if you have thoughts on that, I encourage you to respond to the U.S. Access Board's call for information. But when you're thinking about this, it's really critical that there's not only access to that walk aisle that can accommodate assistive devices, but that there's also access to the actual charging infrastructure from the vehicle, so that somebody who does have a disability can also access a charging facility from their vehicle. So there's some site planning considerations that really need to be addressed. Then finally, if you are going to allow right-of-way public charging along the street, that can help eliminate some issues with ADA access, as some people who do not have a garage at their home are running cables across the sidewalk, which is very much an ADA issue. And so I'm not saying don't allow cords, but because there is an equity issue with also allowing community members to have an electric vehicle at home, and if they don't have parking for that can become an issue. But just thinking about how can the municipality, the local government incorporate EV charging in the right of way, particularly in locations where there is limited or no garage parking. That leads nicely into multifamily. And so there are, of course, many existing buildings do not have adequate electricity service. So as buildings are being redeveloped and they're coming to you for a plan develop, you want to make sure that there is a way for getting those buildings up to capacity needs. However, in the meantime, as I mentioned, in order to ensure equity, it's really important to have public charging stations near multifamily and other underserved communities. You can do that in the right of way. You can do that with nearby parking garages. And then finally, there are other requirements for EV ready and EV installed, and making sure that those new plan developments that are coming your way include requirements for EV. If right-of-way is not allowed, as I already mentioned, there's ADA issues that limit that. And so that's a real issue. And then also, if you do allow charging in the right-of-way, that opens up car sharing, electric vehicle car sharing, which also is getting at that equity concern of not having access to an electric vehicle. So if you allow electric vehicle charging in the right of way, then you can allow electric vehicle shared systems, which is shown in this photo from our car in Minneapolis. Then finally, you really want to evaluate existing locations. The US DOT has a toolkit that includes engagement and outreach and how to identify equity data and where your current charging stations are and how that relates to where underserved communities are located in your community. And so you'll need to do some GIS analysis related to that, but it's highly encouraged to ensure that you're having an equitable distribution of charging facility. And we're on our last slide with non-zoning and state preemption, and I'll turn that over to Brian.
All right, thanks. And just to mention that we have been talking about zoning tools, and of course, many communities are in fact using the building code as a means to address many of these issues in terms of accessibility standards of where things are being installed, and it is an effective tool to do so. But there are some, but we've been focusing on zoning because there are some places where communities do not have the option to use building code as a tool. And from a local government perspective, therefore, we look at the zoning. The building code is in many cases a preferred way to get some of this, although some states preempt local control of the zoning of the building code. Second, there is a number of states have started to address these issues at the state level. We have, for instance, state of Washington as an example. Back in 2013, I believe it was, required cities along certain corridors to meet EV zoning standards. It was set as a floor. They could be more aggressive, but they had to at least meet that. While the state of New Jersey last year passed a law that is uniform and is both a maximum and minimum across the state and became uniform immediately upon adoption, although cities are being required to adopt it formally into their zoning code. So different approaches. California has another approach, and a few other examples in other states. But with that, I think we want to go to quick Q&A.
Awesome. Okay, I'm just going to start railing off these questions because there are a lot of them and they are good. This first one is sort of a multi-part question. How long does it take with the various level 1, level 2, your superchargers? How long does it take to charge a vehicle with each one of those? So that's part 1 of the question.
Well, and the answer is it really does depend, because vehicles actually vehicles can take a charge at different levels. There are older vehicles, including some plug-in hybrids, will have an acceptance rate of the charge only at 3.3 kW, while some of the newer vehicles that have longer ranges, like some of the Teslas and some of the the Chevy Bolt, etc., that are coming. That will take a charge at 11 or 12 kW, and so they will charge a lot faster. But generally, a level 1 charge, as Jessica noted already, is going to take will take anywhere from 8 hours to from 0 to full for a smaller battery car, to a couple of days if you have a very high battery capacity and you're charging only with a level 1. And so it does really depend, and it depends on whether or not you're measuring it from empty to full, or you're measuring it as just from where you're at to full, and the charging patterns are very different. I don't know, Jessica, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add that, most day trips that you're doing from day to day, you're not going to empty the charge of your vehicle. And so even though it would take that long to come to a full charge, as I mentioned earlier, it's really more like charging a cell phone. And so you're charging in your vehicle when you have access to the infrastructure. And because you're not going all the way to empty with your battery, sometimes that level 1 charging is enough actually for most people, because they're only going 50 miles at most in a day, and it might be more like 30 or 45.
Yeah, we have an activist here in the Twin Cities who, when asked that question, how long does it take to charge, he says it takes a minute. because he pulls into his garage, takes him 30 seconds to plug in the car when he gets there, and then when he leaves in the morning, it takes him 30 seconds to unplug. And so, his time was a minute, and it charged overnight. And I have a first generation Nissan Leaf. We've owned it for 7 years. It only gets 80 miles on its battery. We have never charged it on anything other than a level 1 charger. And that was more than sufficient for the commutes that we did.
So I guess part of the reason why I was asking this question is for a more broad statement / question about who we are as humans. Right now, we are very used to seeing, oh, my gas tank light just went on, so I need to go get gas, and I'm going to go do that. And it is going to take me 5 minutes to fill up my tank, and then I will be on my way. So number one, it's going to be a restructure of habit, I guess, for us to rethink about how our vehicles run, because there's going to have to be a lot of like forethought involved in the future. For these charging stations, though, I feel like as humans, we can't just sit there and wait for 20 minutes for our car to charge enough to get us home, if we by chance didn't charge at home. So what kind of infrastructure are we looking at to build around some of the public EV charging stations? Do you foresee that there is going to be, like these charging parks where there's going to be a Starbucks and I don't know, like a mini mart and like things for you to do over the course of the 20-30 minutes that it might take you to charge up your vehicle? And, if you're going cross country or you're traveling further and you don't have a choice but to sit there at a supercharging station for half an hour to an hour, are you foreseeing that there will be certain types of new development that will build around EV stations, or that these sort of mega stations might just sort of pop up, kind of like on the interstate, where you have areas where you can, go off and take a break?
Along the internet, I think it's a different question when you're talking about a transportation corridor versus other places. I think the kind of notion of things being built up around charging, though, I think in any case is not what's going to happen, because any existing place can put in a charger, because electricity is at every business. And so you can put in a level 2 charger at any business tomorrow if you want to. So you don't have to create an EV charging park or place and then build the amenities around it like you would with a gas station. Instead, you already have places where people go, and you can add the EV charging very easily at those places. And as we do new development, we can incorporate that in. And unlike, again, gas stations, every single business could, in theory, have an EV charger. You can't do that with gas stations. You have to have separate infrastructure. You have to have ways to deliver fuel to it, et cetera. The fuel is already being delivered to all those businesses for EV charging. So it's a perception that people have that we're going to have to, the infrastructure development is going to require this enormous new set of land uses. No, we wouldn't have to create anything other than put EVs into existing parking lots to equal or exceed the number of fueling opportunities that people have compared to gas stations. So that's going to be the future and the way things work. And people will, and you're right about the cultural element of it, that people will change. But we already see that, as Jessica noted, it's more like a cell phone than anything else. Those of us who are old enough to remember before cell phones, the notion of having to charge your phone every day was like, who is going to do that? Well, we don't even hesitate. It's just like you get to a place and you plug it in, and we didn't have to build separate phone charging businesses. Existing businesses just incorporated them into their format. You go to a coffee shop now, you can plug in your computer, you can plug in your phone, all those kinds of portable devices with electronics. Everybody's adapted to it.
Would it be responsible for us to somehow figure out how much energy, how much electricity is going towards chargers in our community to ensure that our grid can even handle it? Like, is that even an issue? Do we need to be keeping track of things like that? Do we need to be in communication with like our local power grids to ensure that, you know, we don't need to be capping anything, or, you know, there's a storm coming and everyone's afraid they're going to lose power, so everyone runs to charging stations or is using their chargers at their home because they might not have power for the next 3 days. Like, how can we ensure that we have enough power, even regardless if there's, you know, a weather event coming or just a whole lot of, you know, chargers coming into our community? Do we need to keep track of this?
It does need to be kept track of, and there are different ways to develop the infrastructure that address that very issue. The assumption is that if we fully electrify our transportation fleet, then the amount of peak demand that will increase if we do things right. In other words, if we make sure that we're incentivizing people to charge off peak when they can, which is most people and most charging, or we actually have direct control of chargers so that they can be modulated in relationship to peak demand. The best case scenario is that the full electrification of our fleet would probably only increase peak demand by a few percentage points, maybe 5. In a worst case scenario, however, if we don't attend to it and we just kind of install a lot of non-controllable chargers and what we call dumb chargers, and we don't attend to how that's happening, it could have a big impact on our grid. And that's going to have its own cost. So we have to make sure we do it right. And that slide I showed about the solar stuff is one option, but there are other options as well to address this. So it is something that planners should be thinking about in their community. And in fact, we generally are advocates for planners attending to electrical infrastructure even beside the EV issue, because it is increasingly a question of, as we electrify a lot of different things, how we're accommodating that and how the city right-of-ways are being used to make sure that we have infrastructure that addresses the 21st century needs of our households and our businesses.
I feel like that perhaps destination communities or vacation towns might have even like a slightly different take on some of this as well, just because they're going to have a lot of folks that, you know, are going to be coming and going at all times, all days, and will have to access more public chargers, and they won't be doing it at the normal times and things like that. So I feel like that's a group that has like a whole other set of concerns that they might need to deal with as well.
And then I just wanted to add in that there was a question about utility, and Brian, you're talking about how the local government really needs to be aware of what's happening with capacity issues. You don't have to do that alone. You can work with your utility, and it's highly encouraged that you do so. As part of our EV Smart programming, because we're looking at how communities can accelerate adoption of EVs in their communities, one of the first action steps that we're expecting of communities is to have that conversation with your utility. Oftentimes, they also have incentive programs, so it's a great way to find out about incentive programs for your community as well. So you don't have to do it alone. Work with your utility.
So in public spaces or even private spaces, I'm not talking about residential, are we in the future at some point looking at there being a charging station at every single parking place, or, you know, I mean, or one charging station, you know, might be able to hook up to like 2 vehicles or something like that? But is that where we're headed? That, you know, just about every parking space will have a charging capability?
And Jessica, why don't you talk about your Evanston experience? I think that's an example of kind of where cities are going.
Previously, I worked for the city of Evanston, and when new plan developments came in, this was not a requirement, but we were requesting that those new developments be EV capable. So having the capacity there to future-proof that building so that it would be able to have capacity for electric charging and 100% electric charging, if that case may be. And it's also important to remember that this type of charging isn't necessarily just for you know, a small personal vehicle or a large personal vehicle. It can also be for other charging equipment like electric scooters, electric bicycles. electric assistive devices. So if you have that in your multifamily housing and it's a level 1 charger, you can plug in other charging vehicles as well beyond personal vehicles.
Yeah, so I would say, you know, Christine, the direct answer is that we would expect that EV charging equipment will be a routine part of pretty much all parking areas, except maybe the smallest kind of parking areas in the future.
Right now, is there a formula or a ratio of number of public charging stations, I guess, for a community, whether it be like a per capita or like geographically spaced? Where do we begin for those of us that have it, just as like a ballpark, you know, to take to our council members or our mayor, you know, just as a general, like, this is what we're looking at right now. This is where we should be right now.
Yeah, there's actually a wonderful tool for geeks like me called the EVI Pro Lite. It stands for a whole lot of stuff. It's actually developed by the Department of Energy. It's on the AFDC website, and it will allow you to calculate how many non-home public chargers you will need under a variety, under scenarios and circumstances that you get to put in. It isn't down to the city level; it's at the regional level. But they have made it and designed it to model most of the metropolitan regions in the country. I mean, even fairly small metropolitan regions. So you can actually get a region-wide estimate of what that means, and you can put in your own inputs about how many renters do you have versus homeowners. What are your assumptions about what kind of vehicles? Are you going to assume everybody has a battery electric, or are people going to use plug-in hybrids? You can change all those things, and it is anybody who has an interest in kind of calculating that, those load curves that I showed you earlier that I was showing the comparison came from that website. So anybody can access that. It'll tell you how many regionally you need, and then that will really give you an idea kind of on that, whatever that per capita issue is. You can extrapolate from that to your own city to kind of see about, and again, they're just emphasizing the non-home public chargers. And then also the other limitation of it is right now they're not allowing for more than 10% penetration of EVs. So you can't model how many it'll be when you're 100%, but you can get to what it's going to be for a 10% penetration, which most of the country is not even close to yet, obviously. So
that was going to be my next question is, yeah, like, generally the average is not that. That's a lot. Okay, I think I'm just going to ask one more question because I saw some iterations of it. You go to some gas stations now and you're pumping your gas and you get like a little TV screen with advertisements. Is this a good way to offset costs of the infrastructure that's needed to install these from the community's perspective, or even from the private store that might decide to put some charging stations and allowing advertisers on the actual charging stations? Should there be any regulation to that at this point? Should we be looking at that? Should we be looking at that from the community perspective? Should we be, for private developers bringing in charging stations, should we be looking at that at all?
The quick answer is that is already in place for some EV charging. They're already doing that. Jessica, are you familiar with some examples of that?
Well, it's not coming to me right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do know that there are a few communities that have actually installed hundreds of chargers using systems like that to basically pay for them. So there was no cost to the community, or at least over time there won't be any cost to the community. But they get public chargers in place because, obviously you see that at the gas stations. They're not doing that as an experiment. They're doing that because it's a proven revenue model that's actually helping. And the same thing applies to an EV charger. And I will note that I showed a picture earlier in the presentation of a series of Tesla chargers at a Target parking lot. And there were, out of the 10 chargers, I think, 6 or 7 of them were actually actively being used. When I took that picture, I walked down that row of cars, and every single one of those cars had somebody sitting in it. They were not inside sharpening a target. They were staying with their vehicle while they charged, and which opens up an opportunity for someone who wants to do that kind of an advertising at the station, because you would be, even if you're inside your car, they can make sure that you're inundated with charging. Whether there's a regulatory element around it is a good question. I don't really have an answer for that.
We gotta go. It's after 2:30. There's so many great questions. Obviously, our conversation about this is not over. We're gonna have to have everyone back on again to keep talking about this and to keep the conversation going. So thanks to both of you, to Brian and Jessica, for joining us. And thank you back there, Brian Foote, for doing the introduction from the Urban Design and Preservation Division. And of course, all of the divisions that take part in this collaborative effort. Don't forget, we are recording this. We'll have it up on our YouTube channel. There's actually a specific playlist for all the sustainability and resiliency series. You have 1.5 CM credits, 1 of the sustainability and resilience credits available. Visit our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast, to register for upcoming sessions and to get links to the recordings and all of that good stuff. So thanks again to everyone. This was a really great conversation. I appreciate it. Don't forget, Friday we have another session coming up on zoning and equity. And everyone have a great day, and we'll talk next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.